You're about to step into the bustling, sometimes paranoid world of 16th century Constantinople, where the very act of drinking coffee was an act of rebellion. The air hung thick with the scent of spices and intrigue, and you, a merchant, a scholar, or perhaps just a lonely traveler, find yourself drawn to a new strange ritual taking place in the city's shadows. This story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, bubbling hum. It starts with the arrival of a few almost secretive sacks of something called kahwa, the seeds of a mysterious plant from Yemen. They came through the narrow, crowded streets of the ancient city, probably smuggled in by Sufi mystics who had been using the brew for their long, nighttime devotions. They'd found that drinking this dark concoction kept them awake and alert, helping them to meditate for hours on end, their minds sharpened by its strange power. It was the perfect tool for spiritual enlightenment, or so they claimed. You feel a pull, a curiosity that tugs at your insides. The official religious leaders, the ulama, frown upon it, calling it an intoxicant, an innovation bid'ah, that had no place in their traditional world. They likened it to wine, something strictly forbidden. But you see the thrill in the forbidden, don't you? You hear the hushed conversations about a place where you can find this magical drink, a place where people are gathering to sip and talk and plot. It's a space just outside the prying eyes of the authorities, a den of soft rebellion. You follow a winding cobblestone street, the lamplight casting long dancing shadows. You hear the clink of ceramic cups and the low murmur of voices. This isn't a loud tavern. It's a quiet gathering. The air is heavy with the aroma of roasting beans, a smell unlike anything you've ever known, nutty, smoky, and full of promise. As you step inside, your eyes adjust to the dim light. There are no grand signs or elaborate decorations. Just a simple room with men seated on low stools and cushions. They are sipping from tiny cups, holding them as if they are fragile treasures. The preparation itself is a performance. A man, the kahvechi, or coffee maker, stands over a small brazier. He grinds the roasted beans by hand in a brass mortar, the rhythmic thump, 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 a hypnotic pulse in the quiet room. He then scoops the fine powder into a long-handled copper pot called a kesfe, adds water, and places it directly on the hot coals. You watch as it boils and a rich foam rises to the top, so perfect and dark. He carefully pours this into each cup, making sure every person gets a dollop of that delicious aromatic froth. There are no options here, no sugar, no milk, just the pure, potent essence of the bean. This whole process is a ritual of its own, a silent agreement among strangers. They are all here for the same reason, to share a moment of quiet camaraderie, an intellectual stimulation, away from the rigid structure of their daily lives. The conversation you overhear is not about mundane matters. It's about poetry, philosophy, and the latest gossip from the Sultan's court. The scholars, the poets, the artists, they all sit side by side, their social standing, momentarily irrelevant, united by the shared experience of this new drink. The authorities, of course, are not pleased. The Sultan's mutasib, or market inspector, sees these places as dens of vice. He sends his men to raid them, to confiscate the pots and the beans, and to arrest the proprietors. But it's a game of cat and mouse. When one place is shut down, another pops up somewhere else like a mushroom after the rain. The demand is too strong, the fascination too deep. Historians still argue whether the initial religious condemnation was a genuine concern about the brew's intoxicating effects, or a fear of the subversive conversations it was fostering. Was it the substance they were afraid of, or the social revolution it represented? You take your first sip. The liquid is thick and velvety. It's bitter, yes, but with a complex flavor profile, earthy, almost spicy. You feel a warmth spread through your body and a subtle sharpening of your senses. It's not the harsh jolt of today's coffee. It's a more refined, a more gentle awakening. You feel the buzz, but it's a mental buzz, a heightened state of awareness. You listen to a poet reciting verses about love and loss, and his words feel sharper, more poignant under the influence of the brew. Another man, a merchant from Damascus, leans over and tells a story of the coffee's journey, how it came from the hills of Kaffa in Ethiopia, and how the Arabs first cultivated it. It's a taste of the world, all in one small, simple cup. You found something special here. This is not just a drink. It's a new form of society, a new way to connect with people, a quiet rebellion against the old ways. You can feel it the beginning of something significant, something that will change the city and the empire forever. For now, you just sit, sip, and listen, part of a secret club that knows the true power of a cup of coffee. The hushed whispers and secretive sips of the last section couldn't be contained forever. The aroma of roasted beans, once a clandestine signal, became an irresistible perfume that wafted through the crowded alleys. It's a bit like trying to keep a hit song a secret. Eventually, the catchy tune gets stuck in everyone's head. This new habit, born in the shadows, was about to take its bow on the grand stage of Ottoman life. And you, still buzzing from your first taste, find yourself drawn to the epicenter of this cultural explosion. The very first public coffee houses. The year is approximately 1555, and the location is Tahta Kale, a bustling market district near the Spice Bazaar. Here, two Syrian merchants, a man named Hakam from Aleppo and Shams from Damascus, decide to stop playing cat and mouse with the authorities. Instead of operating in a hidden corner, they open a bold, audacious public establishment. They call it a kavahain, a house of coffee. You hear about this place, and with a mix of excitement and trepidation, decide to see it for yourself. As you approach, the scene is completely different from the dim, secretive den you first visited. This isn't just a room. It's a social institution in the making. The doors are wide open, and the air is thick with a richer, more inviting aroma. There are no longer just a few people sitting on cushions. The place is packed. Men of all ages and all classes are here. Merchants haggling over prices, scholars debating poetry, and scribes reading aloud from new manuscripts. It's a cross-section of Ottoman society, all brought together by a shared love for the dark brew. Historians still argue whether the location of this first public kavahane was a deliberate choice or a happy accident. Tahtakal was, and still is, a hub of commerce. Was it a calculated move to capitalize on the flow of merchants and travelers, or simply the most convenient spot for a new business? Whatever the reason, it worked. The coffee house became a part of the city's lifeblood almost overnight. You watch as a man enters, and the kavichi already knows his order, his usual seat. It's not just a business transaction. It's a relationship. The decor, too, is more refined now. Gone are the rough makeshift stools. You see low, elegant tables, comfortable divans lining the walls, and even a few decorative wall hangings. The kavechi no longer grinds the beans in the open. He has a dedicated workspace, and his movements are precise, almost theatrical. He pours the coffee with an artist's flair, creating a perfect foam crest in each small cup. The clinking of porcelain and the murmur of conversation create a soothing backdrop in ASMR soundtracks, centuries before the term was invented. This new space isn't just about drinking coffee. It's about connecting. You see a pair of old men playing tavla, a backgammon-like game, their faces locked in concentration. You see a storyteller, Ta'iya Meda, standing in the corner, captivating the crowd with tales of legendary heroes and clever tricksters. He doesn't need a microphone. The quiet respect of the crowd is enough to carry his voice. The coffee house is a stage, a university, a newsroom, and a gossip column, all rolled into one. It is, for the first time, a truly public third space, not home, not work, but a place for community. It's a radical idea for a society where social life was often confined to private homes or official religious spaces. The novelty of it all is captivating. The patrons sit for hours, not rushing. They sip their coffee, slowly savoring each moment. A quirky tidbit, some of these early patrons would even add spices like cinnamon or cloves to their coffee, a practice that eventually faded out, but was a sign of the early experimentation with the brew. Imagine a cinnamon-infused Turkish coffee. Sounds like a proto-pumpkin spice latte, doesn't it? Just without the fancy names and the long lines. This rapid rise in popularity, however, did not go unnoticed. The authorities, who had been trying to stomp out the clandestine coffee dens, now faced a much larger, more visible problem. The Sultan's officials saw the coffee houses not just as a place to drink a questionable brew, but as hotbeds of dissent. What were all these men talking about? Were they spreading seditious rumors? Were they organizing against the state? The coffee house was a challenge to the established order, a place where people could form opinions outside the controlled narrative. As you sit there, you feel the energy, the intellectual hum of the place. It's a space of liberation, a place where ideas flow as freely as the coffee. You can see the fear in the eyes of a passing official who glances inside. He sees not a simple cafe, but a gathering of independent minds. He sees a threat. And for a moment, you realize the very act of sipping your tiny cup of coffee is a small, quiet act of defiance. This wasn't just the birth of the coffee house. It was the birth of a new kind of freedom. With the rapid expansion of the coffee houses, you can feel the rising tension in the air. The initial fascination gives way to a simmering hostility from the city's power brokers. It's a classic tale, isn't it? Something new and exciting comes along, and the old guard sees it not for what it is, but for what it threatens to become. For the religious and political authorities of the Ottoman Empire, the coffee houses were a ticking time bomb. The most vocal opposition came from the religious establishment, the ulama. They viewed coffee as an intoxicant, akin to wine and therefore forbidden by Islamic law. They argued that it dulled the senses even as you felt it sharpening yours. They preached from the pulpits about its corrupting influence, claiming it was a source of sloth and vice. After all, why were men sitting around drinking a dark, bitter liquid and talking all day when they should be at the mosque or working in their shops? The Grand Mufti himself, a figure of immense religious authority, issued a fatwa, a legal ruling declaring coffee to be haram or forbidden. This religious decree, however, was tricky to enforce. Unlike wine, which was explicitly forbidden in the Quran, coffee was a new substance. The argument was based on analogy, and as any good lawyer knows, analogies can be debated. You overhear a heated discussion in the coffee house about this very topic. One man, a student of religious law, points out that the fatwa was based on the premise that coffee was an intoxicant, but it didn't make you drunk in the traditional sense. It didn't cloud your mind, it cleared it. This subtle distinction was a massive loophole, and patrons clung to it like a life raft. But it wasn't just the religious leaders who had a problem. The political authorities, the Sultan's court, and the Janissary commanders saw a more practical, and to them more terrifying threat. These coffee houses were becoming hotbeds of dissent. People from all walks of life were mingling, not just merchants and scholars, but also ordinary soldiers, disgruntled officials, and political agitators. They would sit for hours talking about everything from the latest taxes to the Sultan's personal life. The coffee house was becoming an unregulated parliament, a place where public opinion was formed outside the control of the state. The Sultan, an absolute monarch, could not tolerate this. He saw these gatherings as seditious, a breeding ground for rebellion. The historical record is a bit messy here, but historians still argue whether the initial crackdowns were driven more by religious zeal or political paranoia. It was probably a little bit of both, a perfect storm of moral outrage and state security concerns. The response was swift and brutal. Sultan Murad IV, known for his severe nature, issued a royal decree banning the consumption of coffee. The punishment was harsh. The first offense meant a beating with a stick, a painful public humiliation. The second offense, you'd be sewn into a leather sack and tossed into the Bosphorus Strait. A truly uncaffeinated and very permanent solution to the problem. Imagine the fear that must have gripped the city. One minute you're enjoying a conversation about the latest poetry. The next you're fearing for your life. Raids became a regular occurrence. The Sultan's men would storm into coffee houses, smashing the copper pots, scattering the precious beans, and arresting anyone they found. The public squares became stages for these brutal displays of power. You walk by and see a coffee house owner being publicly flogged. You see the fear in his eyes, but also a glimmer of defiance. He knows his customers will find another way and another place. And they did. The coffee houses went back underground. They moved into private homes, hidden courtyards, and secluded back alleys. The ritual became even more secretive and cherished. The very danger of it made the experience more exhilarating. You'd get an invitation, a coded message to meet at a certain time and place. The knock on the door would be a secret rhythm. It was all a game, a very serious one, to maintain a simple pleasure. This resistance proved something profound. The taste for coffee and the desire for social connection was more powerful than the Sultan's fear. It was an addiction to more than just the caffeine. It was an addiction to conversation, to community, to a sense of freedom. A bizarre, quirky tidbit from this period, some of the more paranoid authorities suspecting that coffee houses were fronts for something sinister would send spies dressed as ordinary patrons to listen in on conversations. These spies would often get so engrossed in the discussions about art, philosophy, and poetry that they would forget their mission entirely and become patrons themselves, enjoying the conversation and the coffee. The very thing they were sent to destroy ended up captivating them. It's a bit of a tragic comedy, isn't it? The government's best-laid plans foiled by a good book and a great cup of coffee. Despite the brutal crackdowns, the Sultan's men found it impossible to completely eradicate the coffee house. You'll remember their clandestine nature just made them more alluring. It's the human spirit's refusal to be silenced, or maybe just a stubborn addiction to caffeine that made them persist. And as time wore on, the cat-and-mouse game began to favor the mouse. The authorities, perhaps tired of the endless chases, or realizing the futility of their efforts, began to grudgingly accept the inevitable. The coffee house was here to stay. This period of begrudging tolerance marked a new chapter 1, where the coffee house truly began to flourish as a central pillar of Ottoman social life. The dark, secretive dens gave way to bustling, vibrant public spaces once again. You step into a kahvahan, and the atmosphere is electric. It's no longer just a place for a quick sip and a hushed conversation. It's an institution. The most profound shift was in its function. The coffee house became the primary forum for all forms of public discourse. Forget the formal settings of the court or the mosque. If you wanted to know what was happening, you went to the coffee house. It was the original social media, the first public square, where news ideas and gossip could spread like wildfire. You sit and listen, and the conversations are a beautiful, chaotic mosaic of life. A retired janissary tells a thrilling tale of a siege in a far-off land. A young apprentice reads aloud a poem he has just written, his voice shaky with emotion. A merchant complains loudly about the latest customs duties, and a circle of men nods in agreement, their faces serious. What's fascinating is how specialized these places became. They weren't all the same. There were coffee houses for different guilds. The shoemakers would have their own, the spice merchants another. These spaces were part union hall, part social club. Then you had the literary coffee houses where the city's poets and scholars would gather to debate and recite. It was in these places that ideas were born and reputations were made. If you wanted to be a poet, you had to be seen at the right coffee house, your words judged by your peers over a small cup of black coffee. A light and slightly ridiculous detail from this era is the sheer volume of nicknames for the coffee houses. They weren't just called kahvehan. They had colorful, descriptive names like the Coffee House of the Storytellers, the Janissary's Haven, or the Scholar's Nook. It's as if they were trying to give a personality to each space, a testament to their importance in the social fabric. This blossoming of social function, however, did not mean the authorities stopped watching. Far from it. The Sultan's spies were still everywhere. You might not see them, but you know they're there, perhaps in a quiet corner, nursing a cup of coffee and listening to every word. The threat of a crackdown always loomed, a subtle reminder that this freedom was a privilege, not a right. Historians still argue about the exact catalyst for the shift from total suppression to grudging tolerance. Was it simply the exhaustion of trying to police an entire empire's caffeine habit? Or did the state realize that these forms, while potentially dangerous, were also incredibly useful? A clever sultan could use them to gauge public opinion, to test the waters for a new policy, or even to spread his own propaganda. The coffee house was a double-edged sword, a threat to control, but also a valuable source of information. You watch as a storyteller, a meda, draws a crowd. He gestures with his hands, his voice rising and falling with emotion. His tales are not just for entertainment. They often contain subtle social commentary, critiques of the powerful, veiled in the guise of fantasy. The audience listens intently, understanding the hidden meanings. The coffee house is a stage for political theater, a way for the common person to voice their discontent in a place that feels safe, even though it isn't truly secure. So you see, the coffee house wasn't just a building. It was a mirror reflecting the evolving relationship between the people and the state. It was a living, breathing entity, a crucible where culture, politics, and daily life were brewed together, dark and complex and full of unexpected flavor. And as you sit there, sipping your own cup, you can feel it, the hum of a society, finding its voice, one quiet conversation at a time. With the coffee house now a recognized, if still closely watched fixture of city life, the simple act of drinking coffee began to evolve into something much more refined. It wasn't enough just to have the brew. The preparation and consumption became a work of art, a ballet of tradition and etiquette. You've seen the basic preparation, but now you're about to witness the intricate rituals that elevated the coffee experience from a simple habit to a complex ceremony. The ceremony begins not with the pouring, but with the choice of beans. The best beans were meticulously selected, often sourced from the Yemeni port of Mocha. The roasting process was a careful dance, a kahvechi. holding the long-handled pan over the fire, shaking it constantly to ensure an even perfect roast. The smell, a mix of smoky richness and nutty sweetness, was a preamble to the taste. Then came the grinding, not with an electric machine, but with a brass mortar and pestle, or a cylindrical hand grinder called a dibek. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump was part of the atmosphere, a gentle pulse that you could feel in your chest. The coffee itself was the star, but its presentation was everything. It was served in tiny, handleless cups called finken, which were often placed in ornate metal holders called zarf. These holders, made of brass, copper, or even silver, were not just for show. They protected your fingers from the heat of the cup. The zarf was a status symbol, with more elaborate designs indicating wealth and taste. You'd see a man of modest means with a simple copper one, while a wealthy merchant might have one intricately carved with filigree and semi-precious stones. The act of drinking was slow and deliberate. You were meant to savor it, to let the thick, dark liquid coat your tongue. There was no rushing, no gulping. It was a moment to pause and reflect. The coffee was always served with a glass of cool water and a small piece of Turkish delight, or lokum. You were meant to cleanse your palate with the water before the first sip and enjoy the sweet aftertaste of the lokum after you were finished. The order was as important as the items themselves. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact from this time: there was a very serious etiquette about the placement of the finken on its saucer. You were never to place it directly in the center, but slightly to the side to allow for the proper circulation of air. To place it dead center was a sign of being uncultured, a social blunder of the highest order. Imagine being judged for where you put your cup. It's a bit like today's A's are for left-handers debate, but with far more serious social consequences. Historians still argue about the exact origins of these rituals. Were they imported from the Arab world along with the beans, or did they evolve organically within the Ottoman Empire, a unique cultural expression born from the desire to turn a simple drink into a sophisticated art form? The truth is likely a blend of both, with the Ottomans refining and adding their own flair to an existing tradition. The ritual wasn't just about the drink itself. It was about the social contract it represented. Serving coffee to a guest was a gesture of respect and hospitality. A woman's skill in making coffee was considered a mark of a good wife. There's a saying, "The heart is not in the cup, but in the hand that holds it." It was a way of saying, "I care about you and I want to share this moment with you." This tradition became so ingrained that in many places a marriage proposal would involve the potential bride making coffee for the prospective groom and his family. The quality of her brew was a subtle judgment of her character and skills. The final element of the ceremony was the reading of the coffee grounds. After you finished your coffee, you would turn the cup upside down on the saucer, letting the thick sediment drip down. Once it had cooled, a skilled fortune teller or a family member would interpret the patterns left behind. The shapes of stars, animals, or letters were believed to foretell the future, offer guidance, or reveal secrets. It was a blend of superstition, psychology, and tradition, a way to add a touch of magic to the everyday. So you see, drinking coffee in the Ottoman Empire was never just about a caffeine fix. It was a symphony of sensory details, a performance of tradition, and a reflection of a society that valued ritual and connection. It was a full sensory experience, a quiet moment of beauty in a loud and chaotic world. You feel it yourself as you hold your own small cup, understanding now that you're not just drinking coffee. You're participating in a ritual that has been perfected over centuries. As the coffee houses settled into their role as a social and intellectual hub, a new and rather surprising group emerged as their most ardent patrons and, ironically, their most feared enforcers. You might expect scholars and merchants to fill these seats, but you'll remember the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry. Their relationship with the coffee houses was a complex, fascinating dance between discipline and defiance. The Janissaries were an elite corps of soldiers originally taken from Christian families and trained from a young age to be utterly loyal to the Sultan. They were a powerful, highly disciplined force, but by the 17th century their power had grown to a point where they were often more a source of political instability than a guarantor of security. They had their own unique culture, their own traditions, and as it turned out, their own deep love for coffee. The coffee houses became a second home for them. It was a place where they could gather outside of the barracks, away from the rigid hierarchy and constant drills. Here, over a cup of coffee, a soldier was no longer just a number. He was a person with a story to tell, a complaint to air, or a joke to share. The coffee houses near the Janissary barracks became bustling hubs of military gossip, political rumors, and a bit of good old-fashioned camaraderie. This was a place where a seasoned veteran could mentor a young recruit and where soldiers could organize themselves. But this freedom was a double-edged sword. The same conversations that fostered brotherhood could also breed dissent. When the Janissaries were unhappy with their pay, their commanders, or the Sultan's policies, they would use the coffee houses as meeting places to plan protests or even full-blown mutinies. A quirky fringe tidbit. There are historical accounts of Janissary leaders using the intricate patterns of coffee grounds to make secret diagrams for battle plans or to communicate coded messages to their troops. It's a delightful thought, isn't it? A military strategy session disguised as a fortune-telling session. The Sultan and his grand viziers were, of course, very aware of this. The coffee house was a pressure release valve, but it could also become a boiling point. So they tried to use the Janissaries against the coffee houses themselves. You would sometimes see a Janissary officer raiding a coffee house, smashing the pots, and arresting the patrons only to go to his favorite coffee house later that same evening. They were both the police and the criminal, the hunter and the hunted. Historians still argue whether the Janissary patronage of coffee houses was a sign of their increasing indiscipline or a natural evolution of a social need. Was it a symptom of their decay as a fighting force, or just a testament to the power of the coffee house to draw in every social group, no matter how disciplined? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. Their presence in the coffee houses was a microcosm of their wider role in the empire, a force for both stability and rebellion. This duality led to some very interesting and often violent events. The Janissaries were a law unto themselves, and their presence could turn a quiet coffee house into a raucous and sometimes dangerous place. The gentle sarcasm of a storyteller could turn into an open insult to a commander, leading to a brawl. The quiet humming of conversation could suddenly stop as a Janissary loudly demanded a different kind of service. The Sultan eventually realized that the Janissaries, now a political force, were a bigger threat than the coffee houses themselves. In a dramatic and bloody event known as the Auspicious Incident in 1826, Sultan Mahmud II completely disbanded the Janissary Corps, executing many of their leaders and destroying their barracks. With their military power gone, their influence in the coffee houses also waned. This wasn't an attack on the coffee houses, but the unintended consequence was a quieter, more civilian atmosphere. The coffee houses were now free from their most dangerous patrons and enforcers. The Janissaries' love affair with coffee houses was a brief, turbulent, and bloody chapter in their shared history. But it was a chapter that proved just how deeply ingrained the coffee house had become, not just as a place for a drink, but as an essential part of the social and political landscape of the Ottoman Empire, even for the most disciplined of its subjects. As the coffee houses carved out their place in the heart of the empire, another far more insidious habit was taking hold in the shadows. This was not the sharp, invigorating clarity of coffee, but the hazy, dreamlike oblivion of opium. While the coffee house brought people together for spirited conversation, the opium den offered an escape from reality, a quiet, solitary retreat into a world of one's own making. You might not see it at first glance, but the two habits and the two types of establishments that served them ran on parallel tracks, catering to vastly different social needs. The arrival of opium in the Ottoman Empire predates coffee by centuries, but its use as a recreational drug became more widespread in the 16th and 17th centuries, often coming from Persia and India. The substance was consumed in various forms, most commonly by being mixed with a drink or food or smoked. It had a different kind of pull than coffee. Coffee was about engagement with others, with ideas, with the world. Opium was about disengagement, a gentle fade into forgetfulness. The places that served opium, the Efyanhain, were the antithesis of the vibrant social coffee houses. While the Kavahain was open and public, a stage for community, the Efyanhain was secretive and private. You would not find a meta telling stories or men debating philosophy here. Instead, you would find quiet, almost silent figures reclining on low cushions, their eyes half closed, lost in a reverie. The air was thick with the sweet, sickly smell of the drug, a stark contrast to the smoky, rich aroma of coffee. The clientele was different, too. While the coffee houses were a melting pot of all classes, from the poorest porter to the wealthiest merchant, the opium dens attracted a more specific crowd. They were often frequented by artists, mystics, and poets, those who sought creative inspiration or a temporary escape from the pressures of the world. But they also drew in those who had lost their way, the broken souls seeking a balm for their pain. It wasn't a place for political debate or social gossip. It was a sanctuary for the weary and the heartbroken. Historians still argue whether the concurrent rise of coffee and opium was a coincidence, or if they catered to two different but equally strong impulses in society. Was one the answer for those who wanted to engage with the world, and the other for those who wanted to leave it? You can almost imagine the choice on one corner, the promise of a lively debate and a sharp mind. On the next, the sweet relief of forgetting. The social perception of the two substances was also a study in contrasts. While coffee faced political opposition, it was often viewed with a sense of pride as a sophisticated intellectual habit. Opium, on the other hand, was generally seen as a vice, a dark habit that led to ruin. The government's stance was also different. While they tried to suppress coffee for political reasons, they often tolerated opium consumption, perhaps because it didn't foster the kind of public discourse that led to rebellion. A person lost in an opium haze was not a threat to the Sultan's throne. A quirky and rather sad tidbit from this era is the practice of opium poets, who would sit in the dens and compose verses while under the influence. Their poems, often dreamlike and nonsensical, were a curious window into the minds of those seeking solace in the drug. These verses were a stark contrast to the sharp, witty poetry recited in the coffee houses. They were a testament to the different paths the two substances could lead you down. So you see, the Ottoman Empire had two very different answers to the human condition. One was a brew that brought people together, sharpening their minds and fostering community. The other was a drug that pulled them apart, offering a solitary journey into a world of illusion. The story of the coffee house is a story of public life and social connection, while the story of the opium den is a quieter, more tragic tale of private escape. The former sought to build a new society, while the latter offered a way to opt out of it entirely. You'll remember the turbulent early days of the coffee house, marked by raids and royal decrees. But as the 17th and 18th centuries wore on the Sultan's gaze upon the kahvehan, was no longer a fixed stare of suspicion, but a shifting, sometimes conflicted glance. Successive rulers had to reckon with the reality that coffee houses were too deeply embedded in society to be simply wished away. The question was no longer if they should exist, but how they should be controlled. Sultan Murad IV's harsh punishments of flogging and execution proved to be ineffective long-term solutions. They were like trying to plug 100 leaks with a single finger. The next Sultan Mehmed IV and his successors largely adopted a more pragmatic approach. They realized that a total ban was impossible, and that the coffee houses could even be a source of revenue through taxation. The state began to grant licenses to kahvechi owners, officially recognizing their establishments and bringing them into the formal economy. It's a bit like a government finally deciding to regulate something it can't get rid of, like a modern-day government taxing tobacco or alcohol. This period of relative tolerance, however, was a delicate balance. The state still maintained a watchful eye. The Sultan's spies, you'll remember, were a constant, if unseen, presence. The authorities would still, from time to time, launch a limited crackdown, not to destroy the coffee houses, but to remind the populace that their freedom to gather was a privilege, not a right. These were usually timed to coincide with a period of political unrest or a rumored plot against the state. The message was clear: you may drink your coffee, but do not mistake this freedom for anarchy. A fascinating and slightly sinister element of this period was the mubashir, a kind of special constable or secret policeman who would frequent the coffee houses. Unlike the earlier spies, who sometimes forgot their mission, the mubashir were there with a purpose to listen, report, and occasionally to make an example of someone who had overstepped the line. You might be in the middle of a lively debate about politics, and suddenly a quiet man in the corner, who you thought was just a poet, would stand up, show his badge, and arrest a speaker for seditious talk. The room would fall silent, the conversation replaced by a chilling realization that freedom of speech was a fragile illusion. Historians still argue whether this shifting policy was a sign of a more enlightened state or simply a form of more effective social control. Did the sultans truly become more tolerant, or did they just find a new, more subtle way to monitor their subjects? The truth is likely a combination of both. The Ottoman Empire was a vast and complex entity, and its policies were often a mix of rigid tradition and flexible pragmatism. The coffee house owners, for their part, learned to navigate this new reality. They would often have a trusted patron who would alert them if a mubashir was in the area. They would steer conversations away from sensitive topics and encourage storytelling, poetry, and games instead. The kahvehaneh became a master of its own self-censorship, a living organism that adapted to its environment to survive. It was a testament to the resilience of human ingenuity, even when faced with the power of an absolute ruler. A quirky, almost unbelievable detail from this time is the practice of coffee house riddles. These were complex riddles or logical puzzles that patrons would pose to one another. They were a seemingly innocent pastime, but they often contained hidden political or social critiques. For example, a riddle about a bird that couldn't fly or a river that ran backward might be a subtle jab at the Sultan's recent policies or the inefficiency of the government. The state couldn't ban riddles, but the people knew exactly what was being said. So you see, the Sultan's gaze never truly left the coffee house. It just changed. From a hostile glare to a calculating eye. The coffee houses in turn learned to live with this watchful presence, evolving from dens of open rebellion to subtle forms of dissent, their power shifting from loud protest to quiet, coded critique. And you, a part of this unfolding history, learn to read between the lines, to hear the silent whispers behind the loud laughter, and to know that a cup of coffee is never just a cup of coffee. After surviving the Sultan's shifting gaze and navigating the tricky currents of political control, the Ottoman coffee house entered what many historians consider its golden age. It was a period of relative stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. The coffee house was no longer a symbol of rebellion or a source of state paranoia. It was an undisputed, deeply loved part of the social landscape. You step into this era, and the atmosphere feels lighter, more relaxed, and infinitely more confident. The coffee houses of this time, the 17th and 18th centuries, were more diverse and specialized than ever before. It wasn't just a single model. They were a kaleidoscope of different functions and atmospheres. You would have your simple, no-frills neighborhood coffee house where old men would meet every morning to sip their brew and discuss the weather. Then you had the grander, more ornate establishments in the bustling commercial centers with intricate tile work, marble fountains, and beautiful courtyards. These were the places for the city's elite, for wealthy merchants to close deals, and for intellectuals to hold court. The entertainment offered also diversified. While the storyteller remained a popular figure, new forms of performance emerged. You would find Karagöz and Hacivat. Shadow puppet shows a form of comedy and social satire that was wildly popular. The humor was often bawdy and political, a safe way to poke fun at the powerful without explicitly naming names. It's a bit like modern-day political cartoons, but with a live, interactive element. Historians still argue whether the Karagöz characters were a reflection of the Ottoman people or a way for the state to subtly mock its own shortcomings in a controlled environment. The truth is probably that they were both at once. The coffee houses also became centers for different forms of music. You would find places dedicated to fasıl, a form of classical Ottoman music performed by a small ensemble. The melodic, sometimes melancholic notes would fill the air, creating a contemplative atmosphere. Imagine a place where you could listen to a beautiful live concert while sipping your coffee. It was a perfect blend of high culture and everyday life. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact from this period is the development of coffee house newspapers. These were not printed papers in the modern sense. They were men, often retired scribes or government officials, who would sit in a coffee house and, for a small fee, recount the day's news from the city and beyond. They would have the latest gossip from the Sultan's court, news of a new caravan arriving from the east, or a report on a distant military campaign. It was a live, oral news service, a testament to how the coffee house had replaced the town crier as the primary source of information. The rituals, you'll remember, also became more refined and specific. The preparation of the coffee was now an established art form, with masters of the craft passing down their secrets from generation to generation. The very act of serving a guest was a sign of respect, and the phrase, "a cup of coffee for the sake of companionship," became a common and cherished saying. The coffee house in this golden age became a symbol of urbanity and sophistication. Foreign travelers to Istanbul, like the French botanist Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, were fascinated by them. They would write in their journals about the vibrant conversation, the refined manners, and the sheer democratic spirit of a place where men of different backgrounds could sit together. They were the envy of Europe, a social institution that didn't exist in Paris or London in the same form. This golden age was not without its challenges, of course. There were still occasional crackdowns, and some religious leaders never truly gave up their condemnation. But the coffee house had achieved a kind of social invincibility. It had become a habit that was too widespread, a cultural institution that was too beloved to ever be truly stamped out. You feel this yourself as you sit in a grand coffee house in Istanbul, the aroma of 1,000 conversations mixing with the rich scent of the brew. This is not just a building, it is the living heart of the empire. The golden age of the coffee house felt like it would last forever, a permanent fixture of Ottoman life. But history, you know, has a habit of making grand gestures to clear the stage for the next act. In this case, that gesture was a devastating blaze that swept through Istanbul. You can imagine it, the frantic ringing of bells, the panicked shouts, and the ominous orange glow on the horizon. This wasn't just a fire. It was a metaphorical cleansing, an event that would reshape the city's social and architectural landscape, and with it, the fate of the coffee house. The Great Fire of 1660 and others that followed were not just a physical destruction, they were a symbolic one. These fires often started in the crowded wooden parts of the city and spread with terrifying speed. The very coffee houses you loved, often made of wood, and filled with flammable materials like kindling for the braziers, were particularly vulnerable. You could see the smoke for miles, a funeral pyre for the old city and the old ways. As the smoke cleared and the rebuilding began, the city's architectural style started to change. Newer buildings were made of stone and brick with wider streets designed to act as fire breaks. This shift wasn't just about safety. It was about modernization. The new city was less organic, less chaotic, and more planned. This new urban plan had a profound, if unintended, effect on the coffee houses. The cozy, secluded alleys where the first secret dens were born were now replaced by more open, exposed thoroughfares. The new architecture favored larger, more public establishments, and the old sense of clandestine intimacy began to fade. But the fire did more than just clear space. It acted as a social reset button. The destruction of so many old coffee houses and neighborhoods meant that when they were rebuilt, they were often owned and operated by new people with new ideas. The old, deeply entrenched traditions, which had evolved over a century of clandestine existence, were now being diluted. The new owners were less concerned with the rigid rituals and more with the business of making money. The fire, in a twisted way, was a natural form of selection, a winnowing of the old to make way for the new. A quirky, almost unbelievable detail from this time is the folklore that sprang up around the fires. Some people believed they were divine punishment for the city's sins, including the sinful habit of drinking coffee. Others believed the fires were a sign that the old city was being consumed to give birth to a new, more powerful empire. You could hear these tales being whispered in the newly built coffee houses, a mix of piety and progress. Historians still argue whether the fires were a major turning point or simply an accelerant for changes that were already underway. Did the fires cause the decline of the traditional coffee house, or did they just speed up a process that was inevitable anyway? The truth is likely that the fires were a catalyst, a dramatic event that forced a change that might have taken a century to happen otherwise. The old, intricate rituals, you'll remember, were a product of a secretive and intimate culture. With the new, more open city, the need for that level of ritual faded. The coffee was still good, the conversation was still there, but the air of sacredness had been singed away. You find yourself in a new coffee house, built from brick and stone with wide windows looking out onto a newly paved street. The furniture is less cushiony, more functional. The Cavechi is still there, but he seems more like a businessman now, less like a high priest of a ritual. The coffee is still delicious, but the feeling is different. It's no longer a place of quiet rebellion. It's a place of commerce and convenience. The fire didn't destroy the coffee house, but it stripped away some of its soul, leaving a more pragmatic, modern institution in its place. As the Ottoman coffee house recovered from the fires and settled into its more pragmatic, modern form, a new rival began to appear on the horizon, not with a roar, but with a quiet, steaming hiss. You might think that coffee would forever be the king of the Ottoman beverages, but the world was getting smaller, and with it came the introduction of a new drink from the distant lands of China tea. Tea, or chai, in Turkish had been known in the Ottoman Empire for centuries, often as a curiosity or a medicinal herb. But it was not a part of the daily social fabric in the same way as coffee. It was the British and Russian Empire's love affair with tea that really pushed it into the global spotlight. With trade routes expanding and Western influence slowly creeping in, tea became more widely available and crucially cheaper than coffee. The coffee bean had to be imported from faraway Yemen, a logistical and expensive endeavor. Tea, on the other hand, was easier to transport in bulk, and soon new tea plantations began to spring up in the Caucasus region, close to the empire's borders. The introduction of tea didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come to compete head-to-head with coffee right away. It came as a polite, quiet guest. You'd start to see small tea kettles appearing in the coffee houses, a subtle nod to the new trend. The tea was prepared differently. It was a lighter, less ritualistic affair. No intricate grinding, no long-handled copper pots, just a simple brewing in a teapot. It was less about ceremony and more about a warm, comforting drink. The appeal of tea was different. While coffee was invigorating, tea was soothing. While coffee sharpened the mind for debate, tea calmed the nerves for quiet conversation. It also had a different social role. Tea was more often served at home, a drink for family and private gatherings, whereas coffee, even in its watered-down form, retained a certain public social air. It was more democratic, too. Because of its lower price, even the poorest families could afford to have tea in their homes. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact from this era is that some traditional coffee houses would refuse to serve tea, seeing it as an uncultured foreign habit. You could see signs outside some kahvehanen that read, "No chai served here," a defiant last stand against the rising tide of a new beverage. It's a bit like an old bookstore today refusing to sell e-books. It's a nostalgic and ultimately futile resistance. Historians still argue whether the rise of tea was a result of economic pressure, a change in social taste, or a subtle sign of Western influence. Did people prefer tea because it was cheaper, or did they grow to like its taste and the different social customs that came with it? The answer is probably a bit of all three. Economic necessity drove its availability, but a change in social norms made it a favorite. The competition between coffee and tea wasn't a loud one. It was a slow, gentle erosion. Over time, more and more people started to prefer tea for their daily casual drinks, saving coffee for special occasions or for the serious intellectual discussions. The tea house, the chai-hain, started to appear often smaller and simpler than the grand coffee houses. These were places for quiet, intimate conversation, a place for a different kind of social connection. The Ottoman Empire was slowly becoming a dual beverage society. You could have a cup of bitter, strong coffee for a dose of intellectual stimulation, and a cup of warm, comforting tea to wind down. The presence of tea didn't destroy the coffee house, but it definitely changed its role. The coffee house had to share the stage, and its monopoly on the social life of the city was broken. It was a small but significant shift, one more step away from the ancient ritualistic past, and one more step toward a modern, more pragmatic future. As the 19th century dawned, a new and powerful force began to sweep through the Ottoman Empire modernization. This wasn't a fire or a new beverage. It was an idea set of reforms known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization. The empire, once a world-spanning behemoth, was now seen as the sick man of Europe, lagging behind the rapid technological and social changes of the West. The sultans and their viziers decided that to survive they had to change, and that change would reach into every corner of society, including the venerable coffee houses. The Tanzimat reforms were a series of decrees aimed at centralizing the government, modernizing the military, and introducing European-style legal codes and education. They were in essence an attempt to make the Ottoman Empire look more like a modern European nation-state. This had a profound effect on the traditional institutions of the empire, and the coffee house, which was so deeply rooted in the old informal ways, was not immune. With the new centralized government came new regulations. The informal neighborhood coffee houses, which had operated largely based on local custom, were now subject to new building codes, health regulations, and taxes. The government wanted to bring everything under its control to standardize it. This stripped the coffee houses of their unique organic character. They became a regulated business, not a grassroots social institution. The reforms also encouraged a shift in social life. New European-style clubs and associations were introduced, places where men could meet for more formal, structured discussions. They were not just about coffee. They were about networking and political organization in a way that the old coffee houses never were. The Sultan and his reformers saw these new institutions as a way to control the social sphere, to move the intellectual and political discourse from the freewheeling, often seditious environment of the Kahvehane to a more manageable, monitored setting. A quirky and rather ironic detail from this time is that the Sultan's court, in its rush to modernize, would often host official meetings in these new European-style clubs, serving coffee with sugar and milk, something that the traditionalists would have considered an abomination. It was a sign that even at the highest levels of power, the old ways were fading. Historians still argue whether the Tanzimat reforms were an effective way to save the empire or a misguided attempt that only served to weaken its unique identity. Did they make the empire stronger by making it more modern, or did they simply make it a pale imitation of Europe, losing its soul in the process? The coffee houses were a microcosm of this larger debate. They became more orderly, cleaner, and more efficient, but they lost some of their chaotic, democratic, and rebellious spirit. The social composition of the coffee houses also began to change. With the modernization of the military and the bureaucracy, a new class of educated urban professionals emerged. They were less interested in the old storytelling and philosophical debates, and more interested in discussing politics, the latest European newspapers, and the new technologies like the telegraph and the railroad. The conversation became less about poetry and more about progress. This was also a time when public education was reformed, and a new generation of Ottomans grew up with different sensibilities. They were less likely to be captivated by the traditional shadow puppet shows or oral storytelling. They wanted to read books, to see plays, and to engage with the world in a way that their grandfathers couldn't. The coffee house had to adapt or die. Many of the old traditional ones couldn't. They were either forced to close down or were replaced by a new, more sanitized version. The traditional coffee house, as you remember it, a place of hidden rebellion, intricate rituals, and a sacred, unwritten social contract, was slowly but surely being eroded. It was being replaced by something more functional, more practical, and more in line with a modern centralizing state. The Tanzimat reforms didn't ban the coffee house, but they did something far more effective. They made it obsolete. They took away its purpose as a unique, unofficial public space and turned it into just another business. The Tanzimat reforms, you'll remember, were a top-down attempt to modernize the empire. But there was another force at play, a slow, gentle influence that was just as powerful: Westernization. As the Ottoman Empire opened itself to Europe, a new kind of social institution began to take root, one that would quietly, almost imperceptibly, erode the traditions of the old coffee house. The traditional kahvehan was a distinctly Ottoman space, but the new places were a pale imitation of what was fashionable in Paris and Vienna. The shift was visible in the architecture and decor. The low divans and cushions, which had encouraged relaxed conversation and long hours of sitting, were replaced with Western-style chairs and tables. The warm, dark interior, with its soft lighting, gave way to bright, airy spaces with large glass windows. The focus was no longer on creating an intimate, communal space, but on a more impersonal, public one. The traditional sezve, the long-handled copper pot, began to be seen as rustic and old-fashioned. The new establishments favored ornate European coffee makers and porcelain cups, often with handles. The entertainment changed too. The meta and the shadow puppet, shows which were so deeply rooted in local culture, were replaced with new forms of entertainment, like music played from gramophones or even simple card games imported from Europe. The conversation itself shifted. You would still hear discussions about politics, but they were now framed through a European lens, with patrons debating the merits of British parliamentarianism or French republicanism. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact from this era is the rise of the à la franga, or French-style fad. Men in particular would adopt Western dress use, French loanwords in their speech, and frequent these new establishments to be seen as modern and sophisticated. It was a social performance, a way of signaling that you were no longer part of the old world, but belonged to a new progressive one. This was a direct contrast to the traditional coffee house, where your social standing might have been irrelevant, but now where you drank your coffee became a clear marker of your identity. Historians still argue whether this Westernization was a genuine embrace of new ideas or a form of cultural insecurity. Were the Ottomans truly adopting Western culture because they believed it was better, or were they just trying to catch up and avoid being left behind? The coffee house became a stage for this cultural drama, a place where the old and the new clashed over a cup of coffee. You would see an old man sitting in a corner, quietly drinking his traditional Turkish coffee from a tiny fincan, while a young, well-dressed dandy at a nearby table would loudly order a café au lait in broken French. It was a living, breathing tableau of a society in transition. The coffee house had always been a democratic space, a place where different social classes could mix. But the new European-style establishments often had a higher price point, which made them less accessible to the common person. They became exclusive clubs for the wealthy and the well-connected, a clear break from the inclusive spirit of the old kahvehan. The new places were cleaner, brighter, and more orderly, but they had lost the chaotic, vibrant energy of the old. So you see, Westernization didn't just change the coffee house. It changed what the coffee house meant. It went from being a unique Ottoman social institution to just another cafe, a generic import from a foreign land. The rituals, the stories, the clandestine rebellion, all of it began to fade, replaced by a more standardized, less soulful experience. The coffee house wasn't just losing a battle to another beverage. It was losing a battle to a new way of life. You'll recall the slow erosion of the coffee house's unique character as westernization and Tanzimat reforms took hold. But this wasn't just a story of decline, it was also a story of evolution. The traditional kavahan didn't just disappear, it was slowly replaced by a new kind of establishment, one that was more familiar to you from your own time, the cafe and the pastry shop. This shift was a direct result of the changing social habits and economic realities of the late 19th century. The new modern Istanbul was a city of students, clerks, and bureaucrats. They were looking for something different from the long, slow, and ritualistic experience of the old coffee house. They wanted a quick, convenient, and affordable place to meet, to read the newspaper, or to simply grab a bite to eat. The traditional coffee house, with its single strong and bitter brew, couldn't compete with the new European-style cafes that offered a variety of drinks. These places served not just coffee, but also tea sherbets and even newly imported sodas. The coffee itself was no longer just Turkish style. You could now find French-style black coffee or even coffee with milk and sugar, a true abomination to the purists. But the most significant change was the introduction of food, especially pastries. The old coffee house was a place for drink and conversation, not for eating. The new cafes, however, were also pastry shops, or pastanesi. They offered a delightful array of sweet treats, baklava tarts, and cakes that appealed to a new, more cosmopolitan clientele. This shift from a purely beverage-focused establishment to one that also served food fundamentally changed the social contract of the space. It was no longer a place for deep, long conversations, but a place for a quick snack and a chat. A quirky, almost unbelievable fact from this era is that the first ice cream parlors in Istanbul were often co-located with these new cafes. Imagine a traditional kahveci, looking on in horror as a patron happily spoons up a cold, sweet concoction in a place that used to be dedicated to a hot, bitter brew. It was a sign of a completely new set of values, a move from the sacred to the whimsical. Historians still argue whether the pastry shops and cafes were a natural evolution of the coffee house or a completely new, distinct institution. Were they a product of a changing culture, or were they the agents of that change? The truth is that they were both. They grew out of the need for a more modern social space, and in turn, they accelerated the decline of the old coffee house by offering a more appealing, more convenient, and more palatable alternative. The old coffee house was a masculine space, a place where men would gather to talk and debate. The new cafes and pastry shops were more open to women. While it was still not the norm for unmarried women to frequent these places alone, it became more common to see families and couples enjoying a treat together. This shift made the new cafes a more inclusive, but also a more sanitized space. The loud political debates and bawdy storytelling of the old kavahan gave way to a quieter, more respectable atmosphere. So you see, the old Ottoman coffee house didn't die a sudden dramatic death. It simply faded away, its role and function taken over by a new kind of social space. It was a slow, gentle extinction, not because the coffee was bad, but because the world around it had changed so completely. The coffee house, once a symbol of a uniquely Ottoman way of life, became a victim of its own success, replaced by something that was a little bit of everything and a lot less of the special something it once was. And so here we are, at the end of our journey through the coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire. You've seen them rise from a whispered rebellion in the shadows to the vibrant beating heart of a city, and finally to their slow, quiet decline. The story of the Ottoman coffee house is not a tragedy, but a slow, natural extinction, a fading echo of a bygone era. It wasn't destroyed by a single decree or a single fire. It simply ceased to be relevant in a world that had moved on. The traditional coffee house didn't die out because people stopped drinking coffee. On the contrary, coffee and tea are now more popular than ever. The old, authentic Kavahain simply lost its reason for being. The political function of the coffee house as a public forum for dissent was taken over by newspapers, political clubs, and later the radio. The intellectual function was absorbed by universities, libraries, and salons. The social function was dispersed among new modern institutions like cafes, pastry shops, and even private homes. The coffee house, once a unique and essential nexus of all these things, was no longer needed to fill those roles. The intricate rituals you'll remember which made the coffee house such a sacred space were stripped away in the name of efficiency and modernity. The slow, deliberate grinding of beans gave way to the faster, more uniform process of commercial roasters. The delicate dance of serving and sipping from a Finken and Zarf was replaced by the quick, convenient service of a modern cafe. The reading of coffee grounds, once a common and cherished practice, became a quirky footnote, a bit of cultural nostalgia rather than a serious part of daily life. Today, if you were to visit a place like Istanbul, you might see a place called a Turkish coffee house. But if you look closely, you'll see that it's not the same. It's often a place for tourists, a themed cafe that sells postcards and souvenirs. It might serve a delicious cup of coffee, but it lacks the soul, the history, and the vibrant democratic chaos of the old places. It's a museum piece, not a living institution. The traditions are preserved, but the spirit is gone. Historians still argue whether the decline of the traditional coffee house was a sign of a society losing its identity or a sign of its successful modernization. Was it a sad end to a beautiful tradition or a necessary step toward a more open, globalized culture? The truth, as always, is that it was a bit of both. We lose something when the old ways fade, but we also gain something new. So as you lay here, with the echoes of ancient Constantinople fading in your mind, you can appreciate the arc of this story. From a secretive act of rebellion to a magnificent public institution to a slow, gentle sunset, the coffee house of the Ottoman Empire wasn't defeated. It simply completed its journey, its purpose fulfilled. It leaves behind a legacy of conversation, of community, and of the simple, profound power of a cup of coffee to bring people together. Now, as the stories fade and the images soften, your eyelids feel heavy. The city, with its whispers and its secrets, is falling quiet. The aroma of spices and the hum of conversation are now just a distant memory. The gentle clinking of a ceramic cup gives way to the peaceful rhythm of your own breathing. The world of history is a vast and fascinating place, but tonight it's time to rest. Close your eyes, let go of the day, and drift into a calm, dreamless sleep. Everything is okay. There is nothing left to do but dream. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams.